It's been a while since I did any videos about waggler fishing. Today it's a dark winter's day. It's raining, very grey, and I don't know whether I'll be able to get out fishing later today or not. However, I just want to talk about 5 basic mistakes that people make when waggler fishing, especially inexperienced waggler anglers. Wagglers are pretty simple floats, but it's easy to go wrong on all sorts of different ways. The first mistake that many people make is choosing too light a float. These floats take between about 3 AAA with that one, and this very thick one takes 3 Swan. If you have a float that takes too little shot, for instance, you pick a float that takes 2 BB and you try and fish in 8 foot of water and you try and cast it out 15 or 20 yards, you're going to struggle. If you ever see someone fishing a waggler and you hear this great big swishing noise every time, then they need a float that takes more weight for a start. That's the first thing. So pick a float that enables you to not only cast the distance you need, but a bit further, maybe a third further than you actually need. There are times when very small floats are useful, floats that just take 2 BB, fishing in quite shallow water, and that can be on a canal or a pond, or even on a river. If you're fishing on the shallows, you may trot a very small float. You need to make it as light as possible, fairly short float. But quite often a bigger float, a longer float, will make it much easier to cast. It will be less likely to pull out of position from where you've cast it when you sink the line and try and beat the wind. And it can still be fairly sensitive. That second thing, sensitive, that's the second thing we need to think about. These two floats are designed for very different things. This one is a standard river waggler. It says 3 AAA, 1 BB, 4 number 4. And it's the sort of float I used to use on the River Nene above Peterborough. You'd have the 3 BB, 3 AAA and 1 BB lock-in on the float. The 4 number 4 would be split as a bunch of 3 number 4s about 3 foot from the hook, and then 2 or 3 number 8s spread out down the line below that. And that was a very stable and sensitive rig, and it's got about a 3mm tip. So that's designed for roach, very much for roach fishing, catching other fish like skimmers, silver bream, dace and stuff like that. This other float, which is pretty much exactly the same length, is just a piece of very thick peacock quill, and that was useful on the River Wye when you wanted to drag a load of shot, about 4 or 5 foot of line on the bottom, to float fish for barbel. Not particularly big barbel, but I was getting barbel between under a pound up to about 5 or 6 pounds. And because it's got such a thick tip, it doesn't drag under so easily, and you'd leave quite a lot of tip sticking out of the water, quite a lot of shot down the line, about at least 2 Swan locking it, and quite strong line, a sort of 6 pound reel line. So 2 totally different floats there, and I would think the thicker one's probably nearly 8mm thick, so it's much less sensitive than the other one. And the 3mm one isn't actually that sensitive either. So it's an ideal river float, but on a still water, when you're looking for really shy bites, you'd go down either down to 1.5 or 2mm, or you'd have a 3mm hollow tip with a scoop out of it, and that makes it very sensitive indeed. Although you can see it like a 3mm, it's as sensitive as a 2mm. And the relationship in sensitivity is the square of the diameter, not just the diameter. So 2 to 3 is the 3mm isn't 1.5 times less sensitive than 2mm, which is the relationship between the 3 and the 2, but the square of 1.5, which is 2.25. So the 3mm is less than half as sensitive as a 2mm, and that's important. This 8mm one is not very sensitive at all. Yet I see people fishing for roach on still waters with floats like as thick as this. Some of the very cheap plastic floats have these very thick tips, which is okay if you want to use them for fishing with what they call the pellet wag, where you need a buoyant tip and to support the weight of a heavy pellet, which is sort of an 8mm pellet. And a sensitive tip will just go down under the weight because it's like holding up a BB shot, whereas the thick tip won't. So they've all got their place, but pick the one that matters. Pick the one that's most suitable for the fishing you're doing. The next mistake, and I'm going to show a photo of this, is when you put locking shot around the base of the float, is to leave a gap of about a minimum of about ½ an inch, just over a centimetre, up to about 3/4 of an inch, maybe an inch, 2 centimetres we'll call that. And that means that when you strike, instead of it hitting, you're striking it to shot, that little gap just gives it a little bit more play, and it just folds. The float can fold under, it can hinge on that more easily. One thing I learned many years ago from a top Yorkshire angler, and it could have been Ernie Wild for those with very long memories, was that he would put a whipped on wire on the base of the float and then a tiny little swivel, not a link swivel, below that, and you put the locking shot through the bottom eye of the link swivel, and that is really flexible on the end, and that folds even better. When a float is made like that, there's a couple of tiny disadvantages. One is that you can't change floats without breaking the rig down because you're not using a float adapter, and the other is they don't cast quite as far or as accurately. If you're fishing in the middle of the Witham, as it was then there was no problem reaching that distance, so it wasn't really a problem. But there are circumstances. I still have 1 or 2 floats with that swivel attachment on the end. It does work. It seemed to work for me on a shallow still water, fishing a float taking about 3 BB, where I wanted a really silent strike, and it makes the strike very, very clean, very gentle strike. So that's the next one. Now these floats are all of a similar length, so there's a sort of ideal length, but there are times when you need to understand whether you need a very long float or a very short float. A short float is useful in shallow waters, on rivers and things. These floats tend to be about, I suppose, about 9 inches long, which is an ideal general length for a waggler. But there are times when you want a much longer float in places where there's a lot of surface drift, and you need to get your line, when you sink the line, right deep down. So by having a longer float, a float of a foot long or even more, that will help. And sometimes you even want a body on the float. A body is good on a float in as much as it increases the shot carrying capacity of the float a great deal. Floats like this, which take, like I say, 3.5 treble A, suddenly becomes a 3 swan float, so you can really have stability out there. The body impedes the strike a little bit, so there's a downside to that as well. The final thing of these 5 mistakes is pick the line you use with care. A lot of people tend to use quite thick lines. I'm talking about roach fishing now on still waters and rivers, when waggler fishing, and you really want a fairly fine line. breaking strains are hard to read with lines. Some are overclaimed, some are underclaimed. My ideal Waggler line for general Waggler fishing is 2 pound Maxima, and that's about the same thickness as the Dave Harrell match line, which is 3 pound, but the Maxima actually breaks at very slightly less than 3 pounds, so they're similar lines basically. And the Maxima, you can leave it up on top or sink it fairly easily, so it's ideal for still waters and rivers, and you don't have to sink the line all the time. I do see people using 3 pound Maxima, 4 pound Maxima for general roach fishing. It's too heavy. You don't need that heavy line. There is a time to step up the lines for general roach fishing, and that's when you start to use these big heavy floats. I'd go up to, for a sort of 2.5, 3 swan float, tend to go up to a 2.5 pound Maxima and maybe a 3 pound Maxima. It's just a bit more robust for those much heavier floats, because you don't want to be cracking off on the float when you're fishing with a heavy float. So 5 mistakes that you can avoid fairly easily. Think about your Waggler fishing and practice. Try different floats when you're fishing. See whether you can see the bites or not, which is sensitivity, whether the float's been dragged out of position, whether you're casting easily to the distance you need. Think about these things and your Waggler fishing will definitely improve. Until next time, that's goodbye for now.